As I'm sure many of you know, working from home is something that has grown, or other forms of remote working as well, have grown in the UK over really quite a long period of time with an increasing number of people. But it has been quite specific to certain occupations and to certain geographies. So white collar jobs and geographies, particularly where commuting may be long or difficult, problematic commuting. We've tended to see that. However, once we went into lockdown, we saw this massive increase in the number of people in the UK who were working from home, often without much notice to adapt to working from home. And estimates from the Office for National Statistics suggest that 45 to 50% of the workforce were working at home during the height of the lockdown period. And it was this massive increase, really, that prompted the research that we did. Deirdre and I have worked in the field of flexible working over many years, and we've looked at remote working as well as other forms of flexible working. And we have looked at implementation issues, we've looked at outcomes. But I think on this occasion, we were very aware that what was happening now was different. It wasn't the same kind of thing that had been researched previously, both by ourselves and by many other researchers who've been interested in this field. What essentially was different under this set of circumstances is that so much of the research work that has been done has been about when people have chosen to work from home, chosen to work from a different location. Clearly, under this set of circumstances, it was something that was required of large numbers in the workforce. So that kind of framed what was happening in a very different way. So as a result, we kind of thought about how we would design this piece of research to maximise the advantage of this rather different set of circumstances. And the first thing that we were keen to include was a longitudinal element. We knew there were a lot of people who had moved to working remotely at relatively short notice, and we kind of anticipated there would be some form of settling in, some kind of adjustment period. And so as a result, we wanted to be able to capture these experiences over a period of time. The method that we used for this was a short questionnaire followed by a qualitative diary that we asked our participants to complete over a period of time. We were keen to allow our participants to define what was important about their experiences, rather than necessarily asking the same questions that have been asked in existing research about working from home. I suppose we didn't just want to get new answers to old questions, but we also wanted to find out if there were new things that were emerging as a result of this kind of experiment in enforced working from home. In order to do this, we used our alumni population as the participants in this study, in both the short questionnaire and in the diary entries. And I want to record our thanks, a huge thanks to the team in the alumni office who mobilised and allowed us to get this out. We went out in the first instance just before the Easter weekend, so in the very early weeks of the lockdown period. And I think it's worth saying that the approach that we adopted has paid off in terms of the type of data that we have got, the richness of the experiences that we have, the richer insights into the experiences that we have gathered from people who went through this experience. And I think one of the hallmarks, perhaps, of this is, as you will see when Deirdre is talking through the findings, there's a complex picture, and indeed there are contradictions in some of the responses that our people gave, the people who completed the diaries and the questionnaires. And I think, that reflects that it isn't a case people simply, loved it or hated it, but actually they had a set of mixed reactions to this new experience of working from home. So With those brief introductory words, I'm going to pass over to Deirdre to talk really through the main findings from the analysis that we've done on this rich and complex data set so far. Deirdre, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending. I'd also like to echo my thanks to our alumni population who participated in the study. And I'd also like to particularly thank two of our colleagues who worked with us on early analysis of the data, Christine Delagi and Dr. Diane Farmer, so thank you. As Claire has talked about, we set up a diary entry system. So we sent out invitations to complete diary entries 9 times over 5 weeks. And we were wanting to capture those experiences without necessarily making assumptions about what they would be. The diary entries were completed by 195 people, and nearly 30% of them completed 5 or more across the 5 weeks. Nearly 40% of people completed just 1 diary entry, but these were across the whole time period. So they were still really valuable and very much appreciated. I'm just going to say a little bit about the transition to home working. 40% of our diary contributors had either not worked from home previously or had rarely done so. Whereas in contrast, 35% of them had reported that they had worked from home most days per week or 1 or 2 days per week regularly. There was an interesting comment by a few respondents who talked about their organisations actioning contingency plans and the swiftness with which they were able to move all staff to working from home virtually overnight, so ensuring business continuity. So that was an important point that was raised. Previously, individuals saw working from home as a way of being able to work on specific tasks requiring focused concentration away from the busy office with associated distractions. Now they were working at home 100% of the time, they had to adjust and develop new patterns of work, introducing a structure to the day or new routines. Some had previously enjoyed the element of choice in working from home, and a small minority actually expressed resentment and in fact anger that this choice had been removed and that boundaries were now blurring because their home had become their place of work. Of those who hadn't worked from home previously, many felt that they adjusted quickly, often by developing a routine, and several noting the discipline that's needed to avoid distractions. So there were a number of themes that have emerged from our early analysis, and I'm going to just say a little bit about each one, taking you through them. So the first was around structure and routines. So here there was a huge variation, as you would expect, in people's experiences and approaches. Many talked of structuring their day. Some spoke of appreciating the flexibility to start work later and then to work later into the evening, so suiting their own work rhythm and feeling that they gained greater efficiency by doing this. Others took advantage of being able to take longer breaks during their usual working hours, perhaps to have lunch with family or to exercise, and then again working later. Some people talked about keeping the routine of the typical working day, explaining that this helped them to manage their hours, to try to avoid working into the evening. And it was pointed out that this was actually important in trying to avoid tensions within the family, as it was important to manage expectations of when one would be available. People linked the need for structure to ensuring delivery and achieving on tasks and goals. And again, the importance of maintaining motivation and greater efficiency. Because of the nature and demands of their jobs, some people reported having to consider time zones when scheduling their day, and perhaps this would be no different to when working in the office, or in some instances, they would normally have been working away from home in those different time zones. The second theme was around working space and equipment. So well-equipped home offices or other dedicated workspaces were talked about, but they weren't the case for everyone. Even those who had some experience of working from home didn't necessarily have such space or equipment, with some referring to previously just using a laptop and sitting on the sofa, but finding this insufficient when they were working from home full time. And an office chair was commented on by many, the importance of proper support so that we, can maintain health and avoid back pain. Allocating suitable workspace to all members of the household was an issue, especially for those who had to consider their children who were homeschooling. The lack of stability or reliability of internet connection is something that I think we can probably all relate to. This provided a great deal of comment and often some frustration and anxiety. Some adjusted their working hours, so starting earlier when the network was quieter. Others talked of company policy, specifically avoiding video meetings to reduce the demands on the VPN system. The third theme was productivity. Interestingly, discussion of productivity occurred in diary entries across the whole period, with some people referring to peaks and troughs, whereas others talked of it settling down after perhaps a week or two of adjusting to the new regime. For some people, working from home allowed them to think and to plan, talking about being more efficient and maintaining, if not increasing, productivity. There were a few examples of organisations monitoring and measuring productivity and noting that it was being maintained or increased. But of course, it was obvious that the nature of people's businesses had an impact here on what they were actually able to be doing working from home. On the negative side, anxiety about the pandemic and its impact and general uncertainty was evident for some, particularly in the early diary entries, and people reported that this impacted their ability to maintain concentration and so was lowering productivity. As I referred to earlier, people worked longer hours, yet still there were concerns about productivity and getting the work done and meeting deadlines. Interdependencies with colleagues were talked about, saying how much easier it had been in the workplace, being able to drop by someone's office to obtain essential information or to sort out some small issue. An interesting challenge was raised about maintaining the same level of concentration and focus when working from home 5 days a week in comparison to when previously choosing to do so just 1 or 2 days a week. Some noted that the normal breaks when in the workplace, the moving between meetings, the coffee machine chat, the casual corridor conversations, that those breaks in work actually aided concentration. And in contrast, the intensity of sitting at one's desk in the home with little reason to move sometimes hampered the ability to focus, and perhaps because of, many mentioned, the back-to-back online meetings. Communication with colleagues and clients was talked about a lot. Most people hugely appreciated the technology available to facilitate keeping in touch, and many commented on video and conference calls as a means of maintaining effective working and also with regard to team cohesion. Communication was smooth in many cases, with collaborations continuing to be effective and calls with colleagues and clients and others continuing as they had done previously. However, this wasn't a unanimous viewpoint, and experiences also varied over that 5-week time period. Some noted that the social aspect of keeping in touch with each other was disappearing over the weeks, and they made specific efforts to ensure that this wasn't the case. Some introduced a slightly more formal routine to keeping in touch, with varying levels of success noted. Others pointed out that they missed the face-to-face contact, and especially the informal and those ad hoc conversations again that take place, noting that those can't easily be replaced. As one person pointed out, sometimes a good face-to-face discussion helps resolve issues. And of course, relationships are maintained through those small and frequent points of contact. Another theme was around line manager support, and this was predominantly from the line managers themselves rather than from individuals commenting on the support they were receiving. Some managers hadn't deliberately worked from home previously, preferring to be in the workplace alongside their team. So this was a new experience for them, requiring some significant adjustments. There was talk of feeling a personal lack of efficiency in completion of their own work because of the time and attention they were giving to ensuring that their team members remained well. Several spoke in that vein about the importance of reassuring their colleagues at such an uncertain time, ensuring that their team members were clear of expectations and able to focus on work. There was a feeling that it was important to give time to allow staff to raise any challenges or concerns, particularly if they hadn't worked from home before. One manager described their previous role as 75% technical and 25% pastoral, with more or less a complete switch of that during the pandemic. Blurred boundaries between work and personal life was a topic which was commented on by nearly everyone, and in relation to different experiences depending on their own personal circumstances. So many talked of practical matters with regard to blurred boundaries, such as the managing space, the Wi-Fi, ensuring everybody had adequate Wi-Fi to be able to conduct what was required. Another comment that was made was around the potential intrusion. So noise from neighbours was referred to, so mowing the lawn, house improvements, affecting one's own rhythm of work and being disruptive, especially when we're on calls. On the plus side, many appreciated spending time with family members, such as having lunch together each day or having the opportunity to provide practical support to children with their studies if required. Some had a lighter workload because of the pandemic and noted less stress as a benefit, but also noted the frustration that the work could actually expand to fill the usual work hours and beyond. For many more, the blending of work and home was leading to increasing working hours, with people reporting that they found it difficult to switch off and get a sense that work had finished for the day, or to avoid working regularly at the weekend. People talked of constant demands on their time and emails at all times with expectation of replies. People described the tensions arising from their home becoming their place of work, valuing their home as a place to rest and relax, to forget about work. And of course, that just wasn't possible in lockdown. In contrast, many adapted and accepted the blurred boundaries, appreciating this opportunity and hoping to work from home more regularly and frequently in the future. And interestingly, this is something that people were commenting on again across the whole time period, across the whole 5 weeks. So it was obviously an issue that was salient for them throughout the time of the study. And the final theme I want to just mention is around health and well-being. One key factor here was the lack of commute while people were working from home. And this was talked about in a number of ways. In the early diary entries in particular, many talked of getting more sleep or using the commuting time for running or cycling or yoga or other forms of exercise, and yet still being able to begin work at a similar or perhaps even an earlier time than when they were in the workplace. In the same vein, people were grateful for the reduced stress with no travelling to work on crowded public transport or no long drives in busy traffic, and the associated money saved on fares or fuel. Some parents talked about the time saved from no commute as part of their complex equation for working out hours spent on childcare and homeschooling versus working hours. Some commented that they missed the downtime provided by their commute, something which gave them a specific time to transition from home to work or vice versa, and to prepare themselves mentally or allow themselves to reflect or use the time for creative thinking. As well as new exercise regimes, people also commented on things like gardening and eating more healthily with more freshly prepared meals, and there was lots of baking mentioned. But there were many comments about isolation, missing social contact with friends and family, as well as with work colleagues. And this was often in relation not just to how oneself was feeling, but also people were expressing concern for their colleagues around this isolation. And people felt guilty about their workload in comparison to colleagues, guilty about the pace of work, which wasn't as swift as it would normally be, guilty about checking in with family and friends via social media during working hours, guilty about taking breaks, guilty about having home deliveries from the supermarket, guilty about focusing on work, guilty about focusing on children. So high levels of anxiety and emotional energy being taken up with these things. Some recognise that the social aspect of working relationships was shifting to a much more transactional approach. Zoom coffee calls worked well in some instances, but for others, conversations became stilted or attendance fell away. A number of people had started a new role or joined a new organisation and commented that it was difficult to build relationships with new colleagues across online mechanisms. So these were just a few of the many issues around physical and mental health that were mentioned. So overall, it was quite interesting in terms of the level of satisfaction expressed, and yet there were also those who expressed overall dissatisfaction. But within those overall perspectives, there were a lot of nuanced factors. Many people found it to be a positive experience and wanted to continue to be able to work from home in the future. However, it was definitely a minority who saw this as being 100% working from home. Respondents had observed many benefits, but most pointed out that a combination of working from home and time in the office seemed likely to be an optimum pattern. A 2-3 day split seemed to be a recommendation for a good number, and concerns were expressed that organisations shouldn't see this as an opportunity to reduce office space automatically. Time to review the patterns of work and to reconfigure office space were recommended. So for many, this worked, and perhaps in ways that they hadn't anticipated. It's a surprise to some, but not to many of us, that most desk work can be done from home. Colleagues can be trusted to fulfill their responsibilities and to deliver. Okay, I'd like to hand over to Sarah now.
Okay, thank you very much, Deirdre. I think it's such an interesting study, and seeing it from the employee perspective is fascinating. I think in terms of thinking about lessons to take from the period, there does seem to be this unanimity wherever you look that the future is going to involve greater flexibility. Over the last couple of months, I've been looking at it from the other side of the manager's desk. I've been talking to a dozen or so employers about lockdown and about what at least then was expected to be reopening. And I talked to a diverse group of organisations, including manufacturing, construction, higher education, professional services organisations, but just across the board, the same expectation that the future's going to be blended. You know, you've got managers who are agreeing with the diarists. Nobody's expecting a rush for full-time home working. It's more like this sort of 2 to 3 days a week for office-based staff. And I noticed that YouGov are saying that 40% of people who'd never worked from home before would like to continue working from home a few days a week post-COVID. So there's a whole new cohort of people who've seen how it works. And then interestingly, YouGov also say that those who worked from home full-time before lockdown, almost half of them are now looking for something that's more blended. So they're seeing the social value of being back in the office. So I don't know, Claire, what do you see in terms of how the study and the other things that we're reading are indicating for the future of work?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think there are sort of a number of things that I'll just say a few brief words about that have kind of come out of both the work that we've done, but also the work that has been done through other studies taking place around similar time, often using different methods as well. I think, I think there is agreement that there is going to be greater demand for people working remotely, without a doubt. And I think that's something that organisations need to think about in terms of how they prepare and respond to that. That certainly comes out. I think, though, that this study, and indeed other studies, have taught us quite a lot more about remote working, working from home, that perhaps hadn't emerged quite so strongly from some of the existing studies. I think we've got a better sense now of the things that work in terms of the kinds of work that can be done well at home, but equally some of the things that don't work so well, that where having employees co-located is more effective. And I think that this move, which obviously was in a crisis situation, kind of made huge assumptions about the nature of the home as somewhere where work could be done effectively. And, that's both about the kit that people have in the home. It's about who else may be in the home trying to do activities at the same time. And of course, in some cases, people may not feel safe in their homes. So that kind of, what we've learned about this is an important aspect. I think it is important to recognise that there is some evidence coming through of this kind of distancing in some ways of people, not just the physical distancing, but kind of psychological distancing from their work organisations. And perhaps, some issues to think about in relation to engaging, re-engaging, particularly where that level of engagement is important for the nature of the work that's done. Just, I think, two other big sort of broad observations. This is a generalisation, but I think it is fair to say that we have a trend in our research here that, generally speaking, the positives that people identified related to work-life issues, and generally speaking, the negatives related to work-related issues. And I think that positives around the work-life particularly is perhaps something that organisations need to really think about, how maybe they pay greater attention to helping employees secure a good work-life balance. And then the final kind of sort of factor that emerged was really when we thought about what has come from these initial findings in comparison to the existing research, ours and other people's work that had been done prior to the pandemic. And I think we found many of the things which were locational about people being physically distant from the workforce, from the workplace, and indeed, I suppose, their colleagues in the workforce, was much of that were things that we did know about previously. Maybe we have more complexity, we have more nuance in relation to that, but many of those findings are similar in relation to the locational aspects. What seems to differ is the relational aspects in relation to their employing organisation, to maybe a lesser degree their colleagues, and indeed their relationship with their work. And one observation I would use to illustrate that was a remarkable absence of mention of their employers. Of course, some people did mention their employers, but in many ways the employer was absent from the diary entries from people. So just quite broad brush, but I think those are kind of some of the main things that maybe need to be thought through in terms of how organisations will deal with this form of remote working as we look forward to the future.
I think that point you're particularly making about how the positives are around balance and the negatives are around work relatedness was illustrated just this morning to me, because I was talking to an investment management organisation, and when they're looking ahead to the future, the senior team are worried about collaboration. They want people back on site because they're worried about how effective people are if they're off site. Their staff want to come back on site, again, 2 to 3 days a week, but they want to come back for the social reasons and for well-being reasons. So what you've got is a wonderful sweet spot in the middle that management and staff want this blended future, but for different reasons, which I think is so fascinating. But I think the whole study, for me, is raising questions about 3 things that begin with C in our future organisations. So that's communication, collaboration, and culture. And I mean, perhaps it's worth spending a few minutes on each of those in turn. And if we think first about communication and what the diaries told us then, because that's something that certainly talking to the employers over the last few months that I've been doing, you know, they're setting huge store on communication. They talk about leadership messaging and they talk about internal comms teams. They talk about getting their line managers to recreate the ad hoc corridor meetings and really have regular calls and messages. But then if you talk to employees, as you've said, the employer's not very visible in this. I mean, what do you think people are going to have to do about comms in the future? Deirdre, do you want to chip in on that one first?
Yeah, well, I think one of the important things is recognizing, as everybody is doing, is the importance of it, but the fact that it's how do you create those informal conversations in a way that they work. You know, how easy is it? People talked, for instance, about some people, colleagues are more easily accessible. I can easily, everybody's there, they're at their desk in the home, but they're at their desk. They're not missing because they're away at meetings. So from that perspective, I can drop them an email or I can expect a reply, or I can catch them on Teams and just have a quick call. But then you have to temper that with the fact that there is that reticence sometimes to do that, and there is still that that thought of it, the intrusion into what people are doing, that disturbing of people by doing those sorts of things. So there was a real mix coming through about people's approaches to communication and their experience of it. I think one thing that's also worth thinking about is how we move from all online meetings to blended meetings. So when we're moving to people being, you know, 2 or 3 days at home or at work, how will that work? I'm sure many of us have been the one who've Skyped into a meeting of 8 or 10 people, and you know, with the best will of in the world, it can be that sense of feeling slightly out of it, and oh yeah, they have reminded me, or how can I speak up? But when you've got 2 or 3 people out of on an online and 4 or 5 people sitting together, how is that going to work? So there's things like that about working out the way forward, I think.
And I think that's a real, because before, with a capital B, before all this, a number of employers and a number of organizations were dealing with that by saying, if anybody is dialing in remotely, we all do it. So we all go and sit at our desks and we all have the same level playing field. But if we're going to move to a future where you know, half people are offsite and half people are onsite, it almost suggests that meetings will have to become more formal in terms of inclusion to make sure that you don't have that disadvantage of being the person who's dialing in. It's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah. Sarah, if I might just add on that, I mean, I think we need to be careful to distinguish between what may be a rhetoric reality gap here. I suspect the vast majority of organisations that these people were working with probably would have talked a very good talk about what they did in terms of communicating, and some positive response to that came through in our diary entries, but equally negative ones. I think, you know, what the test here really of whether or not communication has worked well is how the employee has experienced it. And I think, you know, maybe organisations, rather than rolling out a programme and saying, oh, we've done lots, it's actually really testing with employees whether or not this has actually worked. Because, you know, ultimately, if your employees didn't feel it was a good communication experience, it wasn't a good communication experience here.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. So what we're seeing is the new blended future is going to need much more purposeful communication and testing of the communication. People aren't going to be able to take for granted that just because they're rolling out a program, it's working. And we're seeing there's a report from Aviva that's just been published where over half the people that they've spoken to have said, yeah, their employer's working really hard to create a sense of company togetherness, but actually only 15% of them think it's any good. So there's a long way to go. What about collaboration? What did the diaries tell us about how people were able to collaborate remotely?
So again, I think there were very much mixed perspectives on that. Some people felt that it was easier, and I go back to the point about accessibility there, really, whereas others felt that it was harder. I think the other thing, and again, this links to the way we're working and the way we're discovering the best way to work. Collaboration is all very well, but it's at what cost? So the number of online meetings, there was comments that people were feeling that they were spending all their time online and yet therefore not getting their work done. So there could be that example of collaboration, communication happening, but actually it's taking up so much of people's times. And yet others did talk about yes, it's being easy to contact people.
And I think I found some interesting examples in the employer case studies of people talking about, again, purposeful collaboration and saying that they were doing, what they were doing was, instead of taking the easy option and speaking to the person at the next desk, they were actually thinking about who in the company could help them. And they were saying we were actually working better as a result. However, I think that does lead us into the question of culture, because it's all very well collaborating with people who you already know and in a company where you're personally already well embedded. But there seems to me to be a big future question: if our teams are going to be more fragmented because more people are working remotely and flexibly, how are employers going to establish and maintain the social foundations of work? Claire, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, just first of all, to address the issue in relation to collaboration per se, I think we have to recognise that collaboration means different things in different sets of circumstances. Some work is genuinely interdependent, and as a result, collaboration, if you like, is required. There are some types of work where collaboration is beneficial. There are other types of work that actually are done relatively independently, even if people are called a team, and collaboration may be more of a social support system with that. So I think it's important to think about what actually happens, and indeed maybe what has to happen in the relevant organisation. What is the nature of collaboration in terms of taking that forward? I don't think one of my former PhD students is on the call, but she took a look at this issue about it genuinely interdependent teams. This is pre-pandemic work, but found actually that there was distance also could mean not necessarily people who were working in a different location, but even there were barriers for people who might work on different floors in the same building, that there wasn't this, if you like, psychological co-presence that they needed to experience more free-flowing. So I think, more proactive steps to understand the nature of collaboration, but also take steps in order to promote and facilitate it.
Yeah. What do you think? What would you like to add anything to that, Deirdre?
Well, I think it's just, again, sort of going back to the point about culture. I think what was interesting was around people talking about not being able to feel the company environment. How is the company coping? What are the near future plans? What's the longer term strategy, the projects on the horizon? That sense of how, it not just the day-to-day communication, but the greater understanding of what this organisation is about and how we work, and what's going to happen. So I think there was issues there, but there was also, interestingly, some people still commenting on presenteeism as part of the organisational culture. Some people talking about not being able to take breaks. If I'm away from my desk, there's an assumption that I'm not working. So this organisational expectation that hadn't necessarily really shifted, and yet it may well have done so much further down the line as we are now. So those were the points about the culture. Oh, and sorry, related to that, of course, is the onboarding. I think we've mentioned that, touched on that, but how do newcomers, you know, assimilate into the organisation? And, you know, with all the induction and everything else that can be done, it's those building those personal relationships that is the real challenge, and understanding this company culture, this way of working, what goes on here, and who do I need to be building those relationships with. I think that's something that is really going to be an issue going forward that has to be addressed.
And I think that who do I build a relationship with has ties in very tightly with the presenteeism, and the having to be seen, the having to be there, if we think about the gender impact of this. Because we know that, you know, during the crisis, women have been finding it harder than men to deal with it. There's been more impact on women's mental health, and a lot of that's got to do with the fact that women are bearing the brunt of childcare. But I think that, you know, McKinsey are talking about the fact that women are worried about health and safety in going back on site more than men are, and are also more worried about increased household responsibilities. So it seems to me that we'll have to be careful in the blended future that choices are not made in a gendered way that result in women being the ones who are off-site more often than men are. And you saw that, you know, what I thought was a rather mad idea from Deutsche Bank that people working from home should be taxed because they're not spending money at PrEP. They might as well have taxed instead. But I just think, well, who's that going to be then? That's going to be a disincentive to working from home. Women still have to. So we continue to have this division, gender division within the workforce. But I think we ought to try and sort of pick very quickly at the lessons from this. And then there've been some very interesting questions coming in. I just thought very quickly, I mean, actually, I think that we've had a question about managers, because I was wondering, what have managers learned during lockdown? And I know that an early on question was, yes, did the study pick up a sense of the importance of having an effective line manager? And we talked in terms of line managers about boundaries and communications. You know, it seems to me that the boundary thing is not a surprise, is it? We knew that for people working from home, working flexibly, boundaries are already different. But I think it means that the reminder is that managers are going to have to be really careful going forward into how they enable people to manage boundaries. Claire, do you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, been much work done on the role of managers in facilitating and indeed in impeding flexible working prior to this. I think it becomes an organisation that is really looking to kind of develop a trust-based style of leadership where people aren't seen as needing to be monitored because they aren't physically present in the workplace. I think, you know, this requires us to think about perhaps support and development line managers need themselves in order to change their approaches. But I always think, I mean, in many senses, line managers are sometimes the ones who are hammered in relation to organisational problems. And much of this, I think, often reflects the way in which line managers themselves are managed. If line managers are tied into delivering tight targets, line managers often adopt the ways they know, rather than perhaps being open to exploring different ways of doing things. So I think line managers play an important role and will continue to and need to think seriously about their roles. But I think there's also a bigger question in terms of how line managers themselves are treated and managed inside organisations.
Yeah, I see there's an interesting comment in the box there from Daniel Lammy saying line manager communication is a perennial issue. We've now got a pressing need to help them develop the skills and confidence they need to be better communicators. And I think that, you know, I've certainly been picking that up in my employer conversations, that they recognise that it's the line manager who has to be checking in, not checking up, essentially, and being a conduit for organisational culture and messages. There was an early on question about to what extent do you believe the effectiveness of transition to working from home has been a result of organisational readiness versus personal engagement. That was from John Handley. I had a particular comment on that just to say that those employers who were either digitally ready They talked about being able to do this seamlessly, but it also bringing it back to the managers. It was really important for managers to have had some experience of managing people remotely beforehand. So it seems to me that the organizations that have done this well have had a combination of, they've had the tech and the kit in place, and they've also had experienced managers, so they weren't having to learn everything from scratch. And going forward, that has to be the two areas for investment for any organization to make a blended future work. Has to be getting the right infrastructure, but also the right manager training.
I think just to add to that, Sarah, though, that our data would show that it was largely about personal commitment and personal determination to make it work. Many of our people, particularly those who hadn't worked from home before, felt that they weren't actively being supported in terms of equipment and business readiness in that sense, being able to shift office from the workplace to the home. So I think, you know, that again, it's this rhetoric reality gap, that the employer's saying one thing, but actually a lot of the employees giving perhaps a different perspective there.
It could be that perforce employers are going to have to start bridging that gap in future. Yeah. Because it's going to be, I don't think this is a genie that will go back in the box. People are going to expect to be able to work from home some of the time, and they will have they'll be able to make a case to do it. It's going to be very hard for any organization to say, we don't do that here. The kind of manager who says, hey, COVID's over, you know, back in the office tomorrow morning, everybody. That's just not going to wash anymore, because even under the right to request flexible working, you're going to be able to show that you've done it successfully already. So it is, you know, I think it's a huge challenge for employers over the next year or so. I'm taking a look at some of the other questions that are coming in. Here somebody was talking about that, Simone Bartley talking about onboarding and research that shows that the honeymoon period of higher engagement for an employee in their first year disappeared during the pandemic. And a response from Jeff saying, I'm not sure if that's good or bad for the honeymoon phase to be absent. Any thoughts on that, Claire or Deirdre?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, existing research does show that there is this, when people are new to organisations, that, you know, it takes some time. But what I think is this work kind of captures in some senses, and I think Deirdre alluded really to it also previously, and I think in some ways maybe explains some of the contradictions that we found within our data. Just to give an example of that, there might be somebody who on the questionnaire scored a fairly high degree of satisfaction, but then over a series of diary entries, we're actually talking about really quite a lot of negative things. And I think the context of what was going on is actually quite important here, that, you know, I think many people felt an obligation to be able to cope in some senses, whilst we're in a global pandemic, to be putting their hand up and saying, I'm not very satisfied, you know, kind of felt in some senses that people weren't doing their parts from that. So whilst we set it up over a period of 5 weeks to do this, obviously we didn't really have an insight into how long this was all going to go on for in a second lockdown in the UK context. And I think that you know, time is important, but perhaps as people have seen it less as doing their part in an emergency situation, that those sort of more negative feelings perhaps have come a little bit more to the fore as a result of.
Yeah, certainly the managers I spoke to, I was speaking to them in September, October, so they were looking back over a 6-month period, and they were almost unanimous in saying people really pulled the stops out at the beginning. People have worked long hours, very hard. It's not sustainable. I think everybody was very realistic about the fact that it had been an extraordinary period, and therefore the importance was to learn what was going to be applicable to normal times rather than to pandemic times. And certainly now, I think that as we see people having to, you know, looking at this and thinking, actually, this is it for another 6, 9, possibly 12 months, there is going to be even more obligation on employers and managers on thinking about basically privileging well-being. You know, how are we going to support people to stay well when they are working remotely and disconnectedly, especially if we are seeing this burgeoning, this move from initial huge well-being, goodwill to try and make things work, to now a disconnection, in a sense that this is an organisation that isn't really thinking about my well-being, and I am getting tired and bored here. So I suppose it's do you think that out of this will come a more human way of managing? Do you think those lessons about the importance of well-being will be taken?
I think they need to be, don't they? I mean, this, as you say, this is going to be going on for the foreseeable future, the immediate future. Managers have got to be addressing, organisations have got to be addressing these issues. I mean, Jean-Charles talks about the boundary management, and organisations need to show support about yes, willingness of individuals to put those hours in, but where's the support for the managing of those boundaries, of those work-life boundaries? Interestingly, another question somebody picked up about the importance, Nicholas, about the importance of having an effective line manager. And actually, there were no complaints about management, interestingly. So there were complaints about, there were concerns, there was anxiety, there was stress, there were concerns about the lack of equipment and the Wi-Fi, but people I don't think there were any concerns raised, I'll have to check, about their line manager not being supportive or not being effective or whatever. So I think that's quite interesting.
So that could be because it's the first two, you were still in talking about honeymoon periods. You're in a period where everybody knew that we were all in it together.
Yes.
And managers were probably being cut a lot of slack at that point.
And that again links to what Claire was saying about the questionnaire, the overall satisfaction with working from home initially. And yet when we unpick what's going on from the diaries, although there were still lots of positive comments, but there were a lot of negatives as well.
Yeah, and it's, in many ways, it's a huge opportunity as well for organisations. We have done something on an experimental basis that would have taken, ages to manage to have this number of people working from home had it been through, normal organisational change processes. And obviously there are things that have been learnt from that, but I think, it has offered, it was a transformation, and it offers an opportunity for us to take that forward. Arguments that perhaps had been used previously no longer to resist flexible working in some cases no longer stand under some circumstances, because it's been shown that people have managed to do certain aspects, sometimes all aspects of their work in a very competent way. And maybe that's one thing that we should acknowledge, because we used our alumni for this study. Most of our respondents are professional workers. Being a postgraduate only university means that most of our respondents were reasonably advanced in their career in areas of professions. So had we had a different profile of respondents, we might also be, teasing out some quite different things. I think we recognise that.
I think we should wrap up, sadly, because we've only got a minute left. But I think just to conclude, first of all, it's great that we've all been lab rats, essentially, for the last 6 months. But employers are going to have to think about this. There is going to be no going back. A blended future is clearly where we're going to end up. And I think what the diary study shows is the nuance and the complexity of it, that we are going to have to think hard about communication, hard about manager skills, in a way that manager skills have been not belittled, but over the last 15, 20 years of moving into more forms of flexible working, everybody has paid lip service to, oh yeah, we have to train the managers to do this, but we haven't trained our managers to do this. And I think what this crisis has absolutely brought into sharp focus is the fact that managers need to be able to manage people, and people are going to be scattered. They're not all going to be at the next door desk. So thank you really very much, Claire and Deirdre. I think it's been a really fascinating study. It's a really fascinating event today. I wish we could keep going with the conversation. There's so many interesting points in the chat box, which I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of those. A quick advert before we close. The next event in this Changing World of Work series is on the 9th of December. It's at 12:30. You've got Sue Vinicum, Elena Dolder and Joe Swinson, my fellow visiting professor, who are going to be talking about women on boards. So are targets the answer for making real progress? I think that's going to be really interesting. It's a really expert panel, so do book in again then. And just thank you all very much for having me, and I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, and thank you, Sarah, for chairing.